Good morning, everyone. Here's your Mormon news update for October 21st, 2025. Today, we're going to start with some information from the Salt Lake Tribune, where it says, on October 14th, President Dallin H. Oaks announced that as his first act as leader of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the 93-year-old had selected D. Todd Christofferson to join the governing First Presidency alongside him and Henry B. Eyring. Who is this fresh-faced 80-year-old Christofferson? As it happens, someone not all that different from Oaks himself. Like Oaks, Christofferson is a lawyer by training and a faith leader whose sermons betray careful, logic-based thinking while generally avoiding the personal. Also like Oaks, the new presidency member has spoken on the role of religions in pluralistic societies and emphasized traditional gender roles in his many public appearances. However, Christofferson has, unlike his older colleague, generally avoided the topic of LGBTQ+ issues. Here is more about this newly elevated church leader. The Latter-day Saint leader, fresh out of Duke University's law school, served as a clerk to federal judge John Sirica when the latter was handed the political corruption case of the century. Despite Christofferson's inexperience, Sirica wrote in his memoir, To Set the Record Straight, The Break-In, The Tapes, The Conspirators, The Pardon, that the young lawyer was to serve as my right arm throughout the Watergate case. The experience changed Christofferson in profound ways. The life lesson I took away from Nixon's experience, the apostle said in a speech decades later, was that my hope for avoiding the possibility of a similar catastrophe in my own life lay in never making an exception, always and invariably submitting to the dictates of an ethical conscience. A weak conscience, and certainly a numbed conscience, opens the door for Watergates, be they large or small, collective or personal. Interesting. This presents a powerful ironic tension when viewed through the lens of his current role. The profound life lesson he took away, that avoiding personal and collective Watergates requires never making an exception, always and invariably submitting to the dictates of an ethical conscience, stands in direct contradiction to the historical and current institutional practices of the church he now helps lead. A church corporation that by necessity of its unique governance has embraced secrecy. Watergate was a masterclass in institutional deceit, cover-up, and the moral erosion of incremental exceptions. Christofferson's vow to submit to an ethical conscience suggests a zero-tolerance policy for secrecy or deception, even small ones. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has a long history of institutional secrecy and managing information. The revelation of the church's vast, undisclosed investment fund, Ensign Peak Advisors, and the subsequent SEC fine for obscuring assets demonstrated a lack of financial transparency, directly contradicting the Watergate lesson of public accountability. The church has also historically withheld or minimized controversial aspects of its past, like polygamy, the priesthood ban, and Joseph Smith's multiple First Vision accounts from its general membership. The church's decades of information control represent a pattern of making exceptions to full disclosure for the sake of institutional protection. As a member of the First Presidency, Christofferson is now part of the highest, most centralized, and least transparent decision-making body. Church decisions, including financial priorities, doctrinal clarifications, and high-level disciplinary actions, are not subject to democratic vote, public debate, or independent review. In this model, the ethical conscience is defined only by the presiding authority, the prophet, rather than being subject to the checks and balances that exposed Watergate. In essence, Christofferson's life-defining lesson was about the dangers of institutional hubris and secrecy in the highest halls of power. The irony is that he is now a vital pillar in an institution where, by design, the dictates of conscience are private, authority is centralized, and transparency is carefully managed. Back to the Tribune article. In a speech delivered in 2017 to a crowd at the University of Oxford in England, the apostle made clear his belief that religions must be willing to accommodate those of differing views within the communities they find themselves. No particular religion or faith tradition should have a right to dictate the moral values and obligations on which a pluralistic society is founded, he told listeners, and a person does not have to be religious to be moral. I find this a classic example of the tension between institutional doctrine and public relations rhetoric. The two statements by D. Todd Christofferson, one about societal pluralism, the other about church practice, do not align and they create a philosophical contradiction. Christofferson's statements about tolerance for differing views clash with the church's own practice of excommunication. His statements are a call for external tolerance and religious freedom in the public sphere. He seems to respect the autonomy of non-members and secular society to govern themselves based on non-religious principles. It is the language of a public servant and advocate for religious liberty. And yet, he is now in the top tier of a church that regularly practices excommunication, the most severe disciplinary action reserved for actions like, among others, apostasy, which the church defines as the repeated, clear, and open public opposition to the church, its leaders, or its doctrine. This is a form of internal intolerance for differing views. If a member publicly advocates for changing church doctrine or speaks out against its leaders, they are subject to being disciplined and removed. This demonstrates that within its own community, the church does dictate the moral and doctrinal obligations required for membership. The statements rely on a distinction between the public square and the private sacred space. Christofferson argues that the church should not impose its laws on the world. This serves the church's interest by safeguarding its right to practice its own beliefs without government interference. However, the practice of excommunication proves that the church demands a strict, non-pluralistic adherence from its own members. The church will remove those who exercise the very freedoms that Christofferson advocates for in the broader society. Back to the Tribune article. D. Todd Christofferson served as the church spokesperson for the controversial November 2015 exclusion policy. He was far from the most senior apostle at the time of its announcement. Nonetheless, Christofferson, side note, who has a brother that is gay, was the one church leader tasked with defending the now rescinded policy that, among other things, labeled same-sex married Latter-day Saint couples as apostates and generally barred their children from baptism. On the evening of November 6th, he gave a hurriedly thrown-together interview in which he explained that the change was prompted by the U.S. Supreme Court's ruling legalizing same-sex marriage. There was a need for a distinction to be made between what may be legal and what may be the law of the church and the law of the Lord, Christofferson said. We regard same-sex marriage as a particularly grievous or significant serious kind of sin that requires church discipline. Shocked, Christofferson's brother Tom still was absorbing the news when he received a message. "If you feel you need to distance yourself from me, I will understand," the apostle texted his brother, who replied immediately, "You have never distanced yourself from me, and I am not going to back away from you in any way." Christofferson has emphasized a traditional patriarchal approach to gender roles. In his 2006 sermon, Let Us Be Men, Christofferson, then a member of the presidency of the 70, broke with his usual style to share a deeply moving memory of his parents. In it, his mother, sick with cancer, had much of the tissue in her neck and shoulder removed, making it painful for her to use her right arm. Rather than take over ironing duties, Christofferson's father, according to his son's telling, sacrificed his lunches for a year to save money for a machine that would make it easier for her to perform the chore. "I was not aware of my father's sacrifice and act of love for my mother at the time," Christofferson said, "but now that I know, I say to myself, there is a man." That has got to be one of the strangest stories I have ever heard. Does D. Todd not realize that his dad could have just done the damn ironing himself? The anecdote ultimately uses a narrative of personal sacrifice to validate an unequal division of labor, making D. Todd's dad the hero for mitigating his wife's burden rather than sharing it or just picking up the damn iron. Next, let's go to ABC4, where it says, Ensign College will be offering 3-year bachelor's degrees on their campus starting in winter of 2026. Ensign College is a private college owned by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints that offers professional certificates, associate degrees, and bachelor's degrees. Starting in winter of 2026, it is now also offering 2 bachelor's degree programs that will take 3 years rather than the traditional 4 years to complete. The 2 new degree programs programs are in communications and information technology and are designed to require 90 credits as opposed to 120 credits. Reportedly, they are ensuring that the shortened degree program does not provide a shortened education. The development of every course relies heavily on input from employers in the industry, said Tim Sloan, academic vice president of Ensign College. By combining our expertise in applied curriculum design with program advisory boards, we ensure that graduates are prepared with real skills that are valued by employers. These programs have also been approved by the Northwest Commission on Colleges and Universities. According to the NWCCU, 90 credit programs also provide the same education outcomes at a reduced cost for students. Additionally, Ensign College referenced multiple studies in their decision, including one that showed that 72% of students and 73% of parents consider 90 credit bachelor's degrees as valuable or more valuable than 120 credit degrees. A 2024 study by the National College Attainment Network showed only 1/3 of public bachelor's granting institutions are affordable, said President Bruce C. Cush. Ensign College is committed to reducing the cost and time needed for a student to gain a college education while gaining the skills and experience that will expand their job and career opportunities. Now let's go to Rebecca Biblioteca for some information on temples that she got from a source that is close to the situation.
I've gotten some confirmation from a source that I trust that there were 17 temples that were going to be announced. I don't know what those temples are. There is one that I've discovered, South Lake in Texas, that the stake seems to be aware of there, even issuing callings having to do with this temple, but it's not officially announced anywhere. So maybe South Lake, Texas was one of the ones that was on the list. But 17 temples on a list that was seen by a source that I have. So here we have a list of 17 temples that now I believe absolutely did exist, according to my source, that Jesus, by the church's own explanation of how it all works, that Jesus gave to President Nelson to be announced. And yet, the Quorum of the 12, or the new acting presidency, all voted, we don't need to really go through with what Jesus told our prophet. We can just kind of crumple that up and throw that in the trash. That's very interesting. It makes you think that maybe it really wasn't Jesus whispering in President Nelson's ear.
I think she's right, and I will be very interested to see how this situation unfolds going forward. Next, have you ever heard of the Stoddard Living Center? I hadn't. It is located in Lansing, Michigan, and their website says, "Welcome to Stoddard Student Living Center." Stoddard Student Living Center was dedicated on October 12, 1975 by President N. Eldon Tanner of the First Presidency of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. President Tanner declared the purpose of the Living Center to be a place where young students can assemble, have living quarters, and where they can learn more of Christ and his ways. Since its dedication, thousands of students have made the Living Center their home while furthering their education at one of the area's many institutions of higher learning. Today, the Stoddard Student Living Center continues to be a haven from the world for all students who call it home. And apparently, they spent last weekend celebrating. Their Facebook page said, "Please join the celebration. The Stoddard Living Center is one of the only church-aligned living spaces in the U.S. outside of BYU campuses. Let's celebrate the history and legacy of this wonderful opportunity for young single adults in Michigan." Wow, the church has its fingers in so many pies. This center, dedicated by a member of the First Presidency, isn't just a spontaneous act of faith. It represents a strategic long-term investment in real estate and demographic retention. By providing church-aligned housing, the church solves the problem of keeping talented youth in the faith and close to the Institute program, regardless of where they attend college. This model is a financially efficient way to export the cultural control of a BYU campus to secular metropolitan areas, securing the spiritual allegiance of a key demographic outside of the traditional church education system boundaries. Now to Facebook, where it says, "Would you like to be able to study and quote from just LDS Women?" Exponent 2 now has a searchable database of over 1,700 quotes from women who have spoken in General Conference. Emily Geddes and Lauren Ard, original creators of the General Conference Sisters website, donated their content to Exponent 2 for safekeeping. Starting in 2024, Exponent 2 volunteers streamlined the database while tagging all of the quotes with speaker, link, link, date, title of the speaker, topic, and scripture reference. Using At the Pulpit's appendix, we expanded the database to include at least one quote from every woman who has addressed General Conference since 1845. The result, over 1,700 quotes in 3,000 plus topics, is an easy-to-use database of LDS women's quotes that can be included in lessons, sacrament talks, and your personal study. And now to KSL TV, where it says an investigation is underway in West Valley City, where a car crashed into a meeting house of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints at 3120 West, 4700 South on Sunday night. A KSL photographer on the scene said they saw people coming out of the church with their hands behind their back. He also saw a lot of liquid on the ground, but says it was unclear where that liquid was coming from. Police have not yet commented on this situation. KSL TV is working to get more information. And someone in the comments on KSL's Facebook post of the event said, "It was a drunk driver. I was in the building when it happened. It was a very loud boom that got our attention. The driver wasn't hurt and was taken to jail." The comments there also showed that there were a lot of people who worried that it was a copycat attack from Michigan. And last up today, let's go to this great quote that says, "I don't care that much about wrinkles and gray hair. I'm more worried about keeping my worldview flexible enough that when I'm older, I don't condescendingly tell young people to play by the rules that worked in my day, with no concern for whether or not those rules still apply." And that's your update for today, folks. I absolutely hope you have the day that you deserve.